All right, well, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 8th Annual Cell and Gene Meeting on the Mesa. I'm Janet Lambert, the CEO of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, the organizer and host of this meeting. Many of you have been to this meeting over a long time, since its early beginnings in 2006 as a scientific symposium. It evolved into this 3-day must-attend meeting in 2011 and has been growing in attendance ever since. This year, we expect more than 1,200 attendees at the meeting, and those attendees have already arranged more than 1,400 partnering meetings. So we wish you all a very productive time here in La Jolla. The growth of this meeting, of course, mirrors the growth of the sector overall. And before we launch into the sort of program of thinking about our current challenges and opportunities, I'd like us to take a minute to look back on the great distance that we've come. When this meeting began, ARM was aware of 218 preclinical therapeutic developers in the sector. Today, we're tracking 892 companies around the globe. That includes 466 companies in North America, 235 in Europe, and 135 in Asia. When this meeting began, we were following 300 active regenerative medicine clinical trials. 8 years later, we're tracking nearly 1,000. Phase 1 trials have grown from 71 to 323. Phase 2 trials have grown from 189 to 579. And Phase 3 trials have grown from 41 to 93. When this meeting began, capital was much harder to come by. Total financings in the sector in 2010, excluding M&A and milestone payments, were $1.5 billion. Year to date, we're at $10.3 billion in financings for the sector. Just to break that down a little bit, since I know this is the lifeblood of many of you. For private equity, 2010, $46 million. Year to date, 2018, $690 million. Venture capital, 2010, $235 million. Year to date, 2018, $2.6 billion. In 2010, we had an IPO market of $31 million. Year to date this year, we're at $1.2 billion. Follow-on public offerings, 2010, $353 million. Year to date, $3.7 billion. I could go on, but I think you get the picture. It's been quite a year and quite an 8-year evolution. Things have also changed at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. The Alliance was founded in 2009 with 17 founding members. We now have more than 300 member organizations in the Alliance, including small and large therapeutic developers, nonprofit research institutions, patient organizations, and tool and technology providers. Co-founded in 2009 by Maury Ruffin and Michael Werner, we now have 14 team members at the Alliance. Significant growth can be a good thing, but it also necessitates change. So I'm sorry to announce that this will be our last year holding the meeting at this lovely Estancia resort, and that next year, in order to accommodate the growth in the meeting, we'll be moving north just a little ways to the Park Hyatt Aviara in Carlsbad, which will give us the opportunity to have everybody on site in one location and to build out the programming and the partnering opportunities for attendees. Sector growth has also prompted us to launch a new European event that we happily call the Meeting on the Med, and which we'll hold in April in Barcelona beginning next year. This is a meeting that combines what had been two separate meetings that ARM held in Europe each year into one meeting that is really meant to mirror the structure and nature of this meeting here for not just a European audience, but an international audience. So stay tuned for more information about that meeting and your save the date card. The growth of this sector has obviously been driven by huge numbers of people and many, many organizations. But just a handful of companies have entered the commercial market, learning lessons along the way that we can all benefit from. This morning, we'd like to give you a chance to hear from some of those pathfinders. To set up that conversation and to welcome the panel, I'd like to now turn the microphone over to ARM Chairman of the Board, Bob Preti. Bob has been the chairman of ARM for the last 2.5 years and will be passing the baton of the chairmanship to Matt Patterson, the CEO of Audentes, for 2019. So please join me in thanking Bob for all of his contributions to ARM over many, many years, and to welcome him to the stage. Thanks.
So good morning, and thank you, Janet. Welcome to the, as Janet said, the final meeting at the Mesa, that's actually at the Mesa. I think next year we'll be calling it the meeting near the Mesa, a meeting from which you can see the Mesa, a meeting somewhat close to the Mesa, a meeting that used to be on the Mesa, it doesn't matter. But we're certainly, what this represents is that this is the end of an era, for sure, and one that highlights yet another turning point in the evolution of the Alliance, and one that more importantly reflects the evolution and the growth of the regenerative medicine and advanced therapy industry. As any good guest, when we started to arrive and we started to see that they were putting the dining room table in the parking lot, we said, it's time to go. And we took the hint. It took us a little while to get there. But now, as we move this forward, we'll be able to accommodate, as Janet said, the much larger audience and the much larger industry that's developed. It's certainly not news to this audience, and Janet's brief overview of the sector this morning clearly showed this. The accelerated growth of the industry continues and led by the success of the gene-modified cell therapies, but supported by positive news, deal trends, and successful capital raises in that and other therapeutic platforms. The sector has never been stronger. That's an understatement for sure. 2 years ago, with a few pivotal programs still out in the future, we sat here and we highlighted that the industry was on the cusp of a drastic change, a true inflection point, one way or the other, hinging on the success of the regulatory approvals of a few products. And last year, 2017, didn't disappoint. And as those products powered through the BLA process on the backs of their transformative clinical data, we recognized that the ecosystem to support the commercial success, while building, hadn't quite kept up with the speed at which the product showed their potential for patients. The ecosystem, including the infrastructure and coordination for setting up the ideal environment for regulation, reimbursement, legislation, and manufacture for these products, all needed work. And we said, well, this is where we need to focus our energies now. And by all measure, we powered through that and learned some valuable lessons. And valuable lessons are continued to be learned, and they inform us of what we need to do and ensure the commercial success of those and future generation products to follow. If we listen. And that's what we're here at this meeting to do, to listen and participate and truly learn from what's happened in the past. No doubt, with products now actually reaching the global market, our ability to deliver these medicines is under intense scrutiny. And the healthcare marketplaces are testing our ability to make, deliver, pay for, and profit from these therapies at scale and in a sustainable way. Still, of course, supported by their tremendous potential to transform the medical landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, it is truly showtime. And yesterday at the member briefing, we heard from Janet and the rest of the staff as to how ARM is faring as an organization in this transformation, how ARM activities have contributed and in many cases led these advancements in the field. Essentially, how well is ARM serving the needs of you, the members, in the goal to produce these therapies at commercial scale. How ARM itself is evolving as an organization, where ARM efforts will be moving over the next year to 3 to continue to hone its leadership position as the preeminent go-to advocacy group in the regenerative medicine and advanced therapy industry. Importantly, as we approach the new year, as part of our strategic planning cycle, we'll be examining what ARM needs to do and be in light of industry positive and negative trends, the types of companies that will likely figure heavily in the industry going forward, the emerging role of big pharma, our relationship with academia, the weighted role of the types of therapies most likely to dominate the landscape, and other epics, not the least of which is what the global role should be for ARM, and how we must be organized to play it, given the globalization of the industry, importantly, the changing landscape in Europe, and the impact of that on our industry. So as we get down to the business of the meeting, thank you all for dedicating your time and considerable talents to this critical effort. I urge you to keep your eyes on the prize, that prize being the revolutionizing of the medicines that will not only treat our fellow humans around the world, a somewhat amorphous topic, but will treat our friends, our family, and ourselves. And with that goal in mind, the rest will come together. That is our shared purpose. And with that, it is our obligation to collaborate, to bring the collective and diverse skills together with the laser beam focus required to finish what we started. And so what have we learned? Over the next hour, we'll have the opportunity to check in on how it's going so far. Our session, Charting the Path, Lessons Learned from Pioneers of Cell and Gene Therapy Commercialization, will include 3 executives in the space that have front row seats as the answers to these important questions unfold. I encourage you to participate in this session and the rest of the meeting. Of course, challenge the panelists and test your assumptions and experiences against theirs. At this point, I would ask Pascal Touchon from Novartis, Ron Phillip of Spark, and David Lennon from Avexis to please join me up on the stage for our discussion. Thank you. I'd be remiss before we started to just shout out and thank Janet and the staff for putting this tremendous meeting on together. Without the really hard work that goes on behind the scenes, obviously none of this happens. So I just ask the staff to please stand and wave, and people to give a very warm thank you to them. Thank you. All right, good morning, John. We have our work cut out for us. So why don't we just start with introductions? Maybe we'll start with you at the end, Pascal, and just tell us who you are and why you're here.
Yeah, good morning. Pascal Touchon. I'm leading the cell and gene activities in oncology at Novartis. And Novartis, as you know, has been extremely active recently in the field of cell and gene, not only with Kymriah in oncology, where I'm leading all the activities from R&D to development, manufacturing, and commercialization, but also we have our good friends, Spark. We have an agreement with them for commercialization ex-US, and we recently acquired Avexis. So it's very strange situation to be like that, having my 3 colleagues and friends there, and thank you for inviting us there. But I think beyond that, I mean, what is very important that we are here also to support this field. We need innovation, we need progress, we need transformative therapies for patients, and we are committed to it. Thank you.
So Ron Phillip, good morning everybody. I'm head of commercial for Spark, and as most of you know, we've launched the first gene therapy for a genetic disease in the US. Obviously I have a lot of learnings from that process. We're still learning as the time goes on, but as you know, also know, we've got multiple other candidates in the pipeline, and all gene therapies. So we're obviously extracting the learnings from what we've been doing on Luxturna and hopefully applying it for the oncoming therapies in the pipeline.
Great. Thank you. So I'm Dave Lennon. I'm the president of Avexis. Actually, coming from Novartis, so I just took over for Avexis back in June of this year. So a few months in. I feel like I'm actually, given it's baseball playoff season, I feel like I'm in the on-deck circle because we're actually not commercializing yet. So we hope to be doing that in short order. So I'm watching these guys bat for a while, but I can give you some comments on how we're thinking about pre-launch and how we move forward to commercialization.
It's great. So if we continue with the theme that we are learning from the past, and that pioneers that have come before this group have put products out on the market to varying degrees of success, maybe I would just start by asking, what would you do differently now? Based on your own experience in combination with what you've learned, what would you do differently now? What have you learned?
So, I mean, it's really tempting to generalize, but it's probably not the smartest thing to do in probably any space. And I think gene therapy is in that same spot. I think each of those previous entrants had their unique dynamics and unique regions that they had to manage access for. I think we were fortunate in having Luxturna with extremely strong regulatory package and the data that allowed us to do things that were a little different, at least in the United States. So I think the traditional market development activities have to happen. I think the biggest thing that we did that was a little bit different was around the access components and try to create some flexibility and options for the marketplace. Having said that, I think we've been successful on the commercial side of the insurance, where I think publicly we've already said we've got about 80% coverage in the U.S., reasonable coverage in the U.S. But on the government side, it's starting to grow, but we clearly see opportunities to do that a little bit better. And we've obviously reached out to CMS to try to get a demo going for Luxturna. The one thing that if I had to do it all over again, we would have tried to do that a lot sooner. And I think that's the piece. It takes a long time to obviously change the traditional pathways, and that's very much true on the government side. And I think they just need more time to process all of the implications with the potential change. And I think I think we would have benefited by going earlier than doing it right around the time that we launched.
So we should come back to that. It's an interesting thought about how early you can go based on what you understand about the product profile and the like and its effectiveness.
Yep.
But, Pascal, what would you do differently?
I was here 1 year ago just, and it's been 1 year of a lot of activities for us with Kymriah. And I remember 1 year ago when I was at this panel, it was just the beginning. I mean, we had obtained the approval of Kymriah in pediatric ALL at the end of August in the US. And I was talking to you at the time about being bold and going global. And I think we've been bold and global in a certain way, but we have 4 lessons that we've learned over the last year. I think the first lesson that it's possible to go global. The second lesson that it's challenging, and I'll explain you why. The third lesson that's transformative, and everything is being transformed without commercialization. It's not only about ourselves as a company and about, of course, the life of the patients, is all the different stakeholders in this access to patient type of objective there. And the fourth lesson is that it's just the beginning. And I think hopefully these 4 lessons could resonate with you and help you to also build the platform for successful development and commercialization of your transformative therapies. When I look at the fact it's possible is really that we managed over just a year not only to obtain a second indication in the US with lymphoma, but to obtain approval in both indications in Europe, in Canada, and we're progressing very well in Switzerland, in Japan, in Australia, and then we are starting to work on other countries as well. So the possibility to go global with a one-time, transformative, custom-made type of therapy is possible. And I think that's a good lesson for the field because we had many people having doubt about that outside of Novartis, outside of companies, some investors having doubt, could that be global? It could be, it can be global. And I think that's a very important lesson for everybody. The second lesson around the challenge is immensely challenging. So you've got to be ready for not an easy ride there because everything is different when you start to go global with this type of individualized therapies and go in many, many countries. So everything is different from the way you can access the starting material, the cells, organize the logistic for the manufacturing, make sure you manufacture high quality and safe treatment there, deliver to patients, and organize all the aspects related to not only regulatory approval, but also the pricing and reimbursement. And on pricing and reimbursement, that's probably another area where it's been truly transformative. And we've seen huge progress in the way the payers have started to consider this type of transformative therapies. But when we started a year ago or a year and a half ago, there was a lot of changes about this idea of a one-off cost and how can you pay so much one-off when it's a one-time therapy. So we were very clear that we were bringing value to the patients, value to the medical community, value to the healthcare system, and value to society with Kymriah, and that we priced in a very adapted way to the healthcare system in which we are delivering that type of therapies, taking into account standard of care, but also taking into account cost effectiveness. And initially, it was of course challenging, but we managed to work in a very collaborative way with various payers. It's still going on right now as we speak, and even though there have been progress in the US, there's still many more progress to be made. The NTAP has just been officialized now on October 1st, so that's one of the type of progress that is happening for that type of therapy. In Europe, where of course it's a different type of situation with single payers, we've seen very positive attitude of single payers toward trying to find a way to work with us collaboratively to make sure that these type of transformative therapy can access patients there. And it was really a record that just a few days after EMA or EU approval, we managed to have an agreement with the NHS in the UK. And for those of you that have worked with the UK or coming from there, you know it's not the easiest payer in the world. And we managed to get an agreement with them to fund Kymriah in the first indications just a few days after the approval. So that shows how if you engage early with the payers and you really educate them in a certain way to show what's the value of these one-time transformative therapies, and you back that with very strong cost-effectiveness data that shows how effective is these therapies to also save cost in the system and create true cost effectiveness, you can find ways. So you can transform the way they look at that. It's changing. I mean, this is the beginning is changing. And then the final lesson is just the beginning. And I think that's something that should be very clear. We've treated around 400 patients now in clinical trials and commercial with Kymriah. Our ambition is to treat thousands of patients, then possibly with new indication, new CAR-T, new type of cell therapy, tens of thousands of patients. So we're just at the beginning of a long journey. And we believe that the path to success for not only Novartis, but more importantly for the physicians and the patients in terms of getting access to these transformative therapies and for the field in general of cell and gene therapies is there. The early attempt of commercialization have not been that successful in the past few years. Now we see the path to success. And I think that's very important for the field that we are just at the beginning, but we strongly believe at Novartis that this is going to be a very successful type of development for patients, for the medical community and physicians, for society, and for business. So it's the healthy relationship between bringing transformative therapies to patients and creating a sustainable business at the same time.
Thank you. David, so you're watching this happen in your own company. You've also, of course, aware of Carticel and its movement into Vericel and its new life, Provenge moving into SandPower, all of these somehow finding commercial success, Dermagraft, Apligraf with Organogenesis moving forward, right? All of these in some degree are successes, and all of them have had their bumps going through. What are you learning watching this? And maybe particularly around reimbursement, but I don't want to guide you, whatever you think.
No, I think there are probably a few things I would point out. I think one is that as it relates to reimbursement, there's a large disconnect between what health authorities want and what payers are going to need to actually reimburse a product. And I think there's a lot of energy going into very fast, rapid development, which leads you with huge gaps when you go to have a conversation with payers about how to articulate the value of the medicine in their context. And I think that aspect of the disconnect between the excitement of health authorities and the readiness of the payers and the payers in particular is really one of the main challenges of trying to bring commercialization of these products so quickly. Avexis, for example, is built on a phase 1 trial. And the reality is a single center phase 1 trial in one market in the US is really a challenging data set to take to a European, German payer who really wants a much more robust package. So that's one of the big disconnects that we see as we move quickly with this therapy, and the enthusiasm from health authorities not matching. And so really thinking through that dynamic is really a key one, and certainly on the reimbursement, component, right, and I think Spark has done a nice job of this, really reframing the value that we bring is really important. So the traditional measures of how you look at reimbursement and how payers think about the value they gain and chronic therapy and budget impact and these kind of concepts, all go out the window, and you need to help them reset the perspective from which they're viewing it. And really thinking about time horizons that they don't consider, like 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the road, how much value is created by these one-time therapies. So that's a big bucket. And I think the other one I am quite interested in is the supply area. I think going global from a small company that's building up, supply quickly becomes a constraining factor. And the ability, I think a lot of the industry is going to be built on the ability of folks who can actually provide supply of these kind of products to the marketplace, who can properly characterize and delineate their product consistently over time and be able to deliver that not just in one market but around the world. So those are really the two things that I'm really looking deeply at as we go forward.
So as reimbursement keeps coming up and getting these products to pay for, I like to think of it as the sunlight that brings the water up through the trees. Without it, there's no tree. So we know this is really important, and we know that we've got to get this right. This is a critical time for us to get it right. Is the price the problem? Are these therapies, because we talk about value, and I feel compelled to make a point that that's something that we in our business, selling manufacturing service, talk about value, but people always tell us our prices are too high, right? Everybody in this room has said that. Thank you. We got the message. But when we try to flip that into, no, it's not the price, it's the value, the argument is that's true, but the price is too high. So you're going to have that same discussion with reimbursement agencies. Is the price too high for these therapies? And that opens up a couple of different Pandora box issues to talk about. But
I just think it's primarily because they're just not used to it. They don't know. They don't have a mechanism to be able to handle it. They haven't built the processes to be able to allow for a seven-figure price tag product to be adopted into their ecosystem. So in the U.S., a perfect example is, I think, obviously with Luxturna, we went below that seven-figure threshold. That's allowed us to, obviously get a little bit more traction than we would have probably otherwise would. But what prevents us in the U.S. is the price reporting mechanisms from allowing more creative payment deals. And that's really what you want. As Pascal said, in Europe, they don't have that restriction. So you can have a healthy dialogue with that access or reimbursement body to be able to structure a deal that allows for the price density or the upfront, sticker shock to be alleviated over a longer period of time. And I think when you look at, depending on the standard of care that you're going against when you're launching, I mean, if you're going in like Luxturna where there was no standard of care, I think, that's a different, issue that you need to solve for versus, places like hemophilia that have, $600,000-$700,000 a year price tag. So when you get to $1 million or $1.5 million or $2 million upfront price, logically you can spread that over time and say, look, if your durability data coming out of the trial says it's at least good for 3 years, and maybe if you add on the phase 1-2 data, you may have 5 years. And so if you're going to a health body or an access and reimbursement body, and you make that argument and they have the mechanism to allow for that amortization or spread of costs based on an outcome, it becomes a lot easier. Whereas in the US, we just don't have that kind of capacity at this point in time. And that's really what I think we need to work on.
Maybe two additional comment on that. One is that the price is only part of the equation, of course, and we discussed about the value. But beyond that, there is two aspects. One is around whether a patient will stay with a particular payer for a long time, for the payer to be able to get the impact of that investment that they are making into treating, curing a disease up front. And that's that's easier in Europe because of the national payers type of system, single payer system, that's for sure. But we have to find mechanism to make sure that this return on investment for payer is there for them one way or the other. The other aspect is the budget impact, and that's more particularly the case in Europe, where most European payers had a very, we say, painful memory of a previous transformative therapy in Hep C. I will not mention which one, but you know which one, which came and immediately was made available to hundreds of thousands of patients. So created a huge budget peak and expenses there that impacted the whole healthcare system in many of these countries there. So with transformative therapy, they're very aware and worried about that. So you have to work with them about that budget impact and say, first of all, in the case of Kymriah or this type of CAR Ts, is going to be progressive because it's not having a box of pills that you give in all pharmacies of the country and then every doctor can prescribe it. It's done in specialized centers that are being trained and certified to offer this progressive access for patients. So it's more progressive. But on top of that, you need to discuss with them and find ways to make sure you understand their budget impact. And you find ways so this budget impact could be mitigated if it's the need they have for a particular access for a particular product there. So this aspect of making sure they have return on investment and then you manage their budget impact creates a collaborative type of discussion with these payers.
You have any comment?
Well, I think we always need to reorient the payers that they're spending a lot of money today to maintain patients in chronic therapies, and that the first point about these therapies is that they're transformational. I mean, they bend the curve of life, so to speak, and I think if we're doing anything less than that, then we're probably not pursuing the highest level of innovation that we can with these types of therapies. And that's an important anchoring point for any of the discussion. So when things get comparative, we always have to come back and say, but hold on, there's nothing like this, right? And that's a first important anchoring point that we always have to have and be proud of and be, that's why we pay for innovation. It's why we invest in healthcare. And it's what should be the driver that people are willing to pay for these kind of medicines. And then there's the sticker shock piece, and I think a lot of it's about being transparent, not surprising people, and then walking them through the logic of why the price accumulates in a one-time payment for one-time therapy versus the things they spend money on that are spread out over years, right? In the case of SMA, the currently available chronic therapy will cost over $4 million in 10 years. So there's a really easy comparison to start to make once you start to create the right frame.
So it sounds like the three of you are saying that it's largely an issue of education at this point.
I think it's education, and then in some markets, it's systems to be able to actually put these things in place.
Operationalize it.
So how is ARM doing? How are we doing as an organization in helping you all with what you're trying to accomplish, and what could we be doing going forward? What do we need to do in 2019 to help? Because all of your individual efforts, you're visiting these agencies, right? So,
I would start suggesting that the idea of value should be upfront. And ARM could help in creating what is the value of these transformative therapies and how can we make sure that this value is understood by all types of stakeholders, because not everybody understands the value piece of it. The other aspect is one of the more technical debate we have with payers is around the fact that we don't have long-term data. By definition, I mean, these are transformative therapies. We just started. We have 1 year, 2 years data. We don't have 20 years data yet. Okay, so they start to challenge us on that. Say, oh, yes, but you're saying that this is going to be long-term durability of response, but you don't have 5 years data. We don't have 10 years data. So how can we influence the system there to say, I mean, transformative therapies, of course, we will have these 5, 10, 20 years data at some point, but it's just not possible to have it today. So what does that mean for the field, and how can we give them confidence that on the basis of the results we have and the shape of the response curve, we really reach a kind of plateau or situations where there is sufficient belief that this is going to be a long-term durability of response there.
Yeah, I think it's just a combination of making the awareness broader, educating them on the value to be gained by supporting these therapies. I personally think that gene therapy is a payer's best friend in many ways, because they can obviously get significant savings, especially if the durability is there. That is, I think, known but not fully accepted And I think some of the limitations in the system obviously prevent us from being able to execute some of those things. In the US, Europe is a different story. Rest of the world will be another story. But I think that piece is where ARM can help us in furthering the awareness and the value that they're going to gain by implementing some of the changes that we're looking for.
So many companies in the space, the enabling technology companies, are working very hard to distribute the products, to deliver them, to make them, to deliver them at a cost equation that works with quality, scalable, and sustainable. So we always talk about. What is it that, what are the challenges associated right now with that side? I mean, if we could make, let's put it this way, if the industry could come up with products and you could charge, say, $50,000 from Chimera, would it be any easier? Would you charge 50? I mean, how does the price of the cost of goods here factor into the value equation?
I think, again, I come back to the value argument. I mean, the value is there, whatever is the cost of goods, or whether it's complexity of delivering there. There is some value that is linked with the clinical efficacy and safety you obtain in these patients there, and whether can you really transform the paradigm of their treatment and avoid these patients that are going through a series of chemo for chemotherapy for many years, and then stem cell transplant, which is extremely expensive, very cumbersome, very risky, to avoid that. So the value is there. Now, of course, what's going to have an impact on the price will be two things. One is the number of patients being treated, because many payers, again, are looking at that from a budget point of view, investment point of view. So the more patients, they have a tendency to ask for a lower cost for them. And the other aspect will be the competition, and I think competition will be needed there. And if there is a possibility to deliver in a very safe, efficient, scalable way globally to many patients, competition will lead to different type of pricing there. But again, the value is a key argument there. Whether your cost of goods or your cost of delivery is very high or very low, the value you're delivering is what should be taken into account by the payers and by society, because that's what we are looking for. It's create value for society, value for the healthcare system. It's not just a markup on cost of goods.
So in the early days of products getting out into the market, some of them even as devices, there was really no infrastructure to support these products. All the infrastructure had to be made. There's more of an infrastructure now. Can you guys talk a little bit about how that's going? I mean, this whole ecosystem we talk about, from collection of cells, transporting them, manufacturing them, delivering them, paying, all the complicated infrastructure needs to be pulled together. How are we doing? Because we are getting, as you mentioned, we're getting products out the door. So,
yeah, well, maybe I can say a little bit on the gene therapy side, and then the cell side. I know, having worked with Pascal on the Novartis side, it's a little different. I think when we look at, I was mentioning capacity is one of the big issues before. I think when you look at gene therapy delivery in large scale and scale where you're trying to do systemic based therapy or larger based therapies, the investment required is very significant. One of the things that people don't, a lot of times AveXis gets typified as this kind of really fast, small scale study and kind of moving forward, but the real value that AveXis created was actually developing a quality manufacturing system. And it's public knowledge, you can look it up in the filings, et cetera. AveXis spent over $700 million before it was acquired by Novartis on one phase 1 trial. So it didn't all go into the phase 1 trial, right? So the rest of it went into manufacturing and some R&D development. And the point there being is that it takes that level of investment to get there. And a lot of these therapies are initially expensive because the infrastructure to build it, right, is not there yet. And I know there are folks working on building some of that capacity, et cetera.
And it's expensive.
Right. And costs will come down, right? It's like any new technology. Yeah. Costs will come down over time as we build more capacity to handle it in the system. I think that's the challenge for the gene therapy process. I think on the cell side, it's probably more complicated than that.
Yeah, I think it's more complicated. Just to be clear on the cost side, I mean, nobody is asking a company that is delivering value with a tablet in CLL today, is very famous tablet being very effective there, what's their cost of goods and how much margin they make on their manufacturing. So I'm not so sure the debate should be around that in this type of transformative therapy. The debate should be around the value we're bringing to the patient, society, to the healthcare system, not about what's your cost of goods and how much is that costing there. But coming back to the delivery, I think we see, and we've built already a global scale when we started our studies, Juliet and Eliana, because we did these studies across continents. We had clinical trial centers in Australia, in Japan, in Europe, in Canada, in the US. So we had experimented already how to build that at a global scale. But of course, it was just a few centers. Now we're increasing the number of centers, and the transformation that is needed is not only at the level of Novartis and how we get organized, is also at the level of the site. And many of these centers that were built around stem cell transplant are now building a cell therapy activity. And I think that's going to be very good for the field in general, because many of them are saying that now it's really the future. And they need to balance their activity, their structure, their organizations, not only the physicians, but the nurses, the coordinators, the administration, the financing around cell therapy. So we are pioneer in that respect, and we see many institutions in the US, but also now in Europe, really getting reorganized, transformed by the arrival of Kymriah in particular to be able to deliver that to patients. So that's something that's going to be very positive for the field, because the next one that comes with cell therapy will benefit for that type of structure that is being built at the level of the hospitals.
So let me start with Ron and ask this question, but I'd like all of you to address this. It's a difficult question about transformative therapies. We say that because these therapies are transformative, then the value equation goes up. We're able to create an industry around that. Generation 1 products, our goal has been to cure, right? We have this pretty lofty goal of curing, not just mitigating disease. Generation 1 products are really, really close to that. And in some cases, we're seeing it actually is happening. What happens to Generation 2 now? How do we set, as a commercial guy coming in and saying, you have to be better than the last product? Have we seen the end of the industry? Are we done?
No.
In certain diseases? How does this?
There's plenty of diseases to go, so I think there'll be no shortage of obviously targets. I mean, we're still playing with kind of the simplistic monogenic diseases on the gene therapy side at this point in time. There's more complicated monogenic diseases. There's more obviously polygenic diseases. There's a plethora of those. So we're just at the beginning. I think, Pascal, we're encouraged by what we see at the beginning, but there's a lot more work to be done, right, in terms of advancing the science, obviously the manufacturing, as well as the commercialization and access topics that we've been covering. But I think in general, we got to start somewhere. I think the places where we're at right now seems like the right place to start at, whether it's Luxturna, whether it's the Avexis product or the cell therapies. People are starting to see the value. I think the one piece that we're going to have to sustain is the regulatory support for innovation. And I think in the US, the commissioner has done an excellent job of supporting that innovation. I'm hoping that will be foundational, and when he transitions to his next big role, that will be a sustained a momentum that we can carry forward into the next administration and beyond. But I think, in general, we're in the early days. There's a lot more to be done. In the actual therapies that we're commercializing right now, you may end up solving for the unmet need, which happens all the time in other disease areas. The natural ebb and flow is you got to move to the next opportunity and where the unmet need can be solved by the technologies that you have.
So how do you get new products in the market then?
I think
I'm saying new products in the same disease indications, right?
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect there, because even though we have now, for example, with Kymriah therapy that brings 81% complete response in kids, in ALL, and 40% in lymphoma in adults, you still have room for improvement. We are not yet 100%. So we need, and we're doing that at Novartis, and I know many here are doing that as well, to find new ways to treat and to improve on the first generation of product there. Now, the key question will be, to me, more the regulatory question than the commercial question, is how are we going to be able to build the right path to approval for clinical development? Are the regulatory authorities going to ask us to do hundreds of patient comparative studies with the first generation? And what is an incremental improvement? What is a radical improvement? And I think that's a debate we need to have with regulatory authorities, but also a debate that the ARM and organizations like ARM should really participate in too, to make sure that we can find the right path to innovation, both the incremental improvement that are necessary and are needed, but also the radical improvement, and consider that this type of disease and situations, you cannot apply the typical type of path that was existing in the past, and you cannot ask us to do hundreds of patients in a comparative study, A versus B, and know what's happening at the end. So there will be a need to be creative there and collaborative with regulatory authorities.
You know, I think there will be those kind of, building on Pascal's point, I think there will be those select areas where you say there's still incremental improvement we can make in a condition because of the first generation technology not being sufficient. I think there are other cases, and gene replacement I think is one of those, where it's just not going to be possible to design a trial and make the investments required to not just show the therapeutic benefit, but get to the scale necessary to deliver the product and really generate a difference. So I often think in the pure gene replacement area of monogenetic disease, first to therapeutic benefit and first to scale are going to be the winners, and it's going to be kind of a winner-takes-all approach in each of these conditions. I think what is interesting if you think about gene therapy 2.0, is generally that a lot of what we've done today is gain-of-function based approaches, which add a functionality to the genes, to the cells of interest. And it's a situation where dysregulation is largely because something is missing in the disease. Most of therapeutics is actually built on the other side, right, which is a inhibition of function or inhibition of dysregulation in some way. And I think that's where, when we think about gene therapy, that's going to be the interesting place to go, because then you start competing in conditions which aren't defined by a single change, but are going to be defined by multiple changes. And there your results are going to vary because of how your target actually impacts that dysregulation, and then the value will change and the population sizes change, and that's when the model will become really interesting. And I think for the folks who are working on more inhibitory-based mechanisms or platforms, I think that's a really interesting place where 2.0 is going to redefine a little bit the commercial model and how we think about value in the space.
I'll pause for a moment here. Are there any questions or comments from people in the audience at this point? Yeah, we have a few. Let's start here. Speak to the box.
Okay. So glad there's a box. I'm curious about the cost that you discussed of, if you had thought ahead of time that it would cost $700 million to get through your phase 1 for a single project and a single trial, would you have made different decisions? Or was that just
I think,
ignorance?
so Avexis was acquired for $8.7 billion, so I think they made the right decisions. I think when you look at it, there were a number of bold decisions made along the way to make investments and to own the entire process, because partnerships were difficult to, maybe not always reliable, and it's a moving and flowing situation. I think as the industry becomes more mature and partners, really sort out their process, it'll be easier to get through that. But I do think, there comes a scale question, which is not a small one. And even today, we're still looking at, we've initiated a second manufacturing site in North Carolina, which is twice as big as the one we have in Chicago, and we know it's not going to be enough. And these are not small investments, so it'll keep going. And I think every company is going to have that challenge of when do I make that investment, how much do I put in, and do I run the risk of not being able to supply the market, which is a big commercialization challenge.
Ron, so last week Commissioner Gottlieb gave a pretty remarkable talk in which he talked a lot about sort of his innovations around this space, but also about the reimbursement landscape. And he suggested that we needed to do some financial re-engineering, some innovation around risk pools, or I don't think I used that word, but to cope with the issue that Pascal raised of portability and the amount of portability, especially in the American private market. But you've said that you mentioned that you've got 80% coverage in the commercial market. So I wonder if you could say more about your experience and whether there have actually been fewer challenges in that market than you anticipated and that maybe Commissioner Gottlieb is seeing.
Yeah, I think Luxturna was unique, and I think the price point made it more unique. There wasn't a therapy available in the marketplace. There wasn't cost that you were offsetting. So there were some inherent limitations in the value extraction that you could make with a product like Luxturna. And because of that, I think we came out with a profile, and I will give credit to some of the flexible options that we put around the price for payers, being the primary reason why they've been so receptive to it on the commercial side. I think that entire conversation changes once you break that seven-figure barrier. I think that's the moment, and I think David is going to experience this probably before most people. I think you're going to start to see the concern come up from the payers, and that's where those additional measures are needed, whether it's risk pools, whether it's solving for the portability issue, whether it's just basic price reporting changes that allow for more flexible and creative payment models. So I think in many ways we did obviously have a lot of scrutiny. I think we handled that relatively well, and we put a product out there that patients are benefiting from and the payers are extracting value from. They thought it was a fair value proposition, and some of the solutions that we put around it ended up working. I think it will be different. I think as the next generation of gene therapies come out, and that additional scrutiny will require some give and take on the regulatory as well as the system side or the ecosystem side to be able to accept them.
Sven?
So thank you very much for your comments about value and the importance of value and having discussions with payers, particularly avoiding cost of goods and things like that. One question I do have for you is the cost of value in the US and in Europe is very, very different to the cost of value in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia. What are you guys doing to try and address that and to make sure that we're able to make these transformative therapies available to patients in these other countries that perhaps are not quite as wealthy and as well off as we are?
So maybe you can start. I think that's a very important question that we're very working hard right now, because particularly for Kymriah, in the sense that it's not only about sending, again, a box of tablets somewhere. It's making sure that you have the right infrastructure for the treatment, you have the right infrastructure to harvest the cells, cryopreserve the cells, send to a manufacturing center, back to the site for the cells, infuse the patient, follow on the patient. So it's a very complex type of setup that we have with cell therapy. So the way we're building that right now is, first of all, before I answer your question on access, is making sure we are organized to be able to treat these patients. We're not going to go all over the world like we did with Glivec when it was a transformative therapy at the time, Glivec. I mean, to reduce mortality in CML to an amazing way. But it was a tablet that could be prescribed by physicians. So we managed to have these tablets sent in many places across the world after the initial approval. And still today, and even before the arrival of generic, we were giving free of charge 1/3 of the Glivec volume in the world at Novartis. So here's different. So what we're doing now is to establish hubs, where we have hubs that could be able to treat the patients and more than treat, manage the patients, manage all the process of manufacturing, of taking the cells, sending to manufacturing site, and so on. And then we're working with these hubs right now in the possibility for them to take cross-border patients. So how can we bring the patient to the site instead of bringing the treatment to the patient all over the world? So we're working right now with various authorities, and that's why we're going in a progressive way for this access, because it's not about sending a regulatory file and getting approved. It's setting up the system. So we're talking with Asian countries, with Middle East countries, African countries, and of course other European countries and Latin American countries, but how can we create these regional hubs? And then once a hub is being formed, how can we obtain and organize possible access for patients there to this hub? So that's the way we're trying to put that together. And at the same time, we have to make sure that we find the right way for that access to be affordable and to be possible. And that's something that we are right now working on, making not only these regional hubs, but organizing a possibility to support access in these countries.
I have two questions. The first one being, given that the pricing is based on a cure, are the payers pushing back when either the patients progress with their disease before receiving the product, or after they are treated, they relapse? The second question is, do you have any pushback from the patient groups who may look at the price and say that the starting material is our own cells and they are being re-energized? Why are we paying so much? Thank you.
So,
I'll take the first one. And I'll let one of these two take the second one. No, I think that's really what the outcomes contracts that we tried to set up for Luxturna were all about. Look, we want to stand behind the product. We had a 93% responder rate in the phase 3 trial. It's the easiest product to stand behind. And I think the payers are seeing that, and they're receptive to the confidence that we have in the product. And they are open to, a large majority of the contracts that we're signing have a outcomes component to it. So they want to have that certainty. Now, there's some limitations in the amount that we can reimburse based on those outcomes, but by and large, they've been really receptive to that approach. So if the product doesn't work for Luxturna, it's pretty simple. Prior to the procedure, you do a baseline test with a known equipment process. And then right after the surgery, the injections into both eyes, you do a measurement, 30, 60, 90. We call that the efficacy measurement. And then 30 months later, we do a durability measurement with the same exact equipment, all calibrated. So the payers know exactly what they're getting. It's completely transparent. And really the only big difficulty that we have is making sure that the patients come back for the 30-month. We haven't quite gotten to that point in time, but that's where portability and some of those other constraints start to come into play.
maybe I'll start with the first before going to the second question. What we do, we work with the payers in two directions. One is when you do cost effectiveness study and you prove to a system that the therapy, when it's being used in a system to all the patients that are part of the indication is cost effective, you already take into account the fact that it doesn't work in all. So that's already taken into account in the cost effectiveness. When you look at the system, at the healthcare system level, the value you agree upon and then the pricing that the value with the system is already taking into account the fact that you will have failures. So at the system level, that's the discussion there. Then of course we also try to be more creative and look at outcome. In PDLL, we did that in the US because that was relatively easy to look at an outcome at a relatively short time point and relatively clear there because the patients that are responding at 1 month are the ones that then will be in prolonged durability of response. On the other hand, lymphoma is much more difficult because in lymphoma you have patients that start in complete response, then relapse, others that start in partial, go to complete, and that could be a year later. So then that starts to be very complex to follow, and an outcome type of deal has to be based on a very clear way to measure outcome. So that's not always possible. So what we do in that case is more that the overall cost effectiveness type of system that we have in place and say at that, the value is there at that price based on cost effectiveness. We are also discussing whether we can evidence that with real world evidence once we've started there, and that's being asked anyway by many national payers, is to be able to prove that 1 year, 5 years down the line, you really bring in that value to the system. And we're fine to discuss that and put in place this type of system. So I think that's really the way it's working. If the outcome is very clear, very easy to measure, we're always ready to discuss that. When the outcome is a bit more complex, a bit more progressive, it's more about the overall type of value we bring to the system through the cost effectiveness and how can we make sure that we can evidence that down the line after a few years. On your second question is interesting. I think there is some misconception about CAR-T in particular, that this is not, of course this is start with the cells of the patient, but there's nothing to do with the cells of the patient. They are transformed cells, they are different. And we didn't have that type of pushback from patient association or advocacy there from that point of view. They are very willing to understand better how is that being made, and they want to better understand because there is a unique relationship with the treatment here, because that's their cells that we are transforming and bringing back to them. So first of all, they want to make sure that what we bring back to them is their cells. So the complexity of the chain of identity and chain of custody that you need to build around that is immense. And then second, they are very interested in knowing what's happening to their cells. So we've put in place some system for the physicians of an interface that allows the patient to be really involved and understand what's happening to his cells and when are they going to come back and what does that mean to him or to her there. And that's really in engaging the patient into this dialogue and understanding for the patients what's really happening and how we're transforming his cells, that we get this good type of I would say discussion and communication with them.
Yeah, I would like to add just, I think on the outcomes discussion, this is really an opportunity, and I think from an ARM perspective or others, to really reframe some of the discussions about how value is transferred in the system. And one of the things, not to throw our pharmaceutical brethren under the bus, but there's a lot of free good type programs up front to get patients started on therapy. And there's a lot of arguments from others, not from the pharmaceutical industry, obviously, that a lot of that is kind of misused in the system to put patients on therapy who don't need it, or to start patients who then don't adhere and lose the benefit of therapy. And this outcomes discussion is actually an opportunity to flip that around, because we can't offer as much free good up front because it's a one-time therapy, and if we start offering it all for free, we don't make money. But we can give that discount on the back end of outcomes, which is actually what the payer wants to achieve. And I think as an industry, we need to kind of help reshape some of that dialogue so people see that investment in outcomes. It should be a requirement of companies coming into the space, because they're no longer giving that discount on the front end. I do think it also then builds to the point around durability of these responses. And portability issues and measurement issues aside, the opportunity to show durability in a real world setting through these types of programs would really help benefit the industry over the longer term, and just improving out the value that we have.
Part of moving these products around, getting them to patients, obviously, is reducing the complexity of what we're trying to accomplish. And yet, Janet went through some numbers that say this is not getting less complex, it's getting more complex. There's more products coming in the market, they're all slightly different, et cetera. In the remaining few minutes we have, if the three of you could just think about what do you see as success, given 29 markets in Europe, 1 market here, Canada, you've got Japan, Korea, China, another. We didn't even get to talk about China, but the rise of that just enormous number of patients and therapies that are being developed. What does success look like in 2 or 3 years, given all of that as an ecosystem? How do you see this playing out?
Maybe I can start. I think that for us, there will be 2 aspects that will be clear. First, can we deliver to thousands of patients across the world? Can we organize everything from the logistic, the access and reimbursement piece, the delivery to these thousands of patients across the world? Because that's our objective. And if there is one thing that keeps me awake at night is how can we go faster? Because today there are patients that are dying and could benefit from the therapy. So how can we go faster? So that's the main objective there. Then the other one is how can we improve on what we have? And as I was saying, how we can go to new indications and expand the usage of this type of therapies, but also improve on new generation of this type of therapies. And how can we accelerate that type of cycle of innovation, not in a traditional way, waiting a few years, 5 years, 10 years before a new type of therapies comes, but having a faster cycle of innovation that allows to permanently improve on these therapies.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with both of those. Scaling is critical, and obviously the next generation of innovation is important in this space. I would just add the third piece, I think you highlighted a little bit, is the 29 different markets and 29 different approaches. For a small company like us, that can be, debilitating, right? And so what we need to have is that awareness, that education, to get to some kind of common vocabulary around these types of therapies, that where we can have a seamless conversation about what do you want, what do we provide, and then coming up with a solution that makes sense. It's harder when you have 29 different approaches. That's obvious, right? So, and having those 29 different approaches just taxes an organization, and it slows down exactly what Pascal said, which is getting the product as quickly to the market as possible.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so I would say a few things. I think one is there's a lot of low-hanging fruit of conditions that can be treated. We really need to see some of these therapies advance with speed, and that gets to my second point, which is how do we overcome the hurdle of production and getting reliable quality product in front of regulators so that they can make an evaluation on these products. And I would hope we do make great progress on that in a few years. And I think the last piece is really reshaping, probably at the senior most government levels, perceptions of how this therapy can transform their healthcare systems and generate the willingness at a government level, not just the payer components of the government, but really the legislators themselves, to really support the industry. Because I think that, and support the industry on the commercialization side, not just the regulatory side.
So we have a few strategic imperatives, if you will, at ARM. They are reimbursement, which is basically market access, reasonable value-based market access environment, a clear and harmonized, to the extent possible, regulatory framework around the world. We've got manufacturing infrastructure that we focus on. We've got an investment work. We have a number of different priorities. How can we simplify this? What do you think you need to leave this organization with today as a charge going forward? What are our top 2, 3 priorities?
Say it should be a catalyst of the change, because again, what we're doing, all of us here, is to transform not only the life of the patient, but also healthcare systems. So how can ARM help us to catalyze these changes? As you said, on access, manufacturing, regulatory environment as well, is something very important there. And we need, of course, to work as individual companies, and we have different agendas sometimes and different type of technologies, but we all have the same goal. So having an organization like ARM that can really be the catalyst of these changes and this transformation will be very important there.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think, the priorities would be reimbursement first, and then obviously regulatory and manufacturing. But in many ways, they're all equally important in order to get us to where we want to go, which is getting more products out to the market.
I mean, I think the priorities are right. I think what this group needs to do is, as this gets more complex, as it gets a little more challenging, is maintain the optimism that we have and have had as an industry. And I think that's the message I hope we continue. Maybe we're a little negative facing a lot of the challenges of reimbursement and those kind of things, but this is amazing therapeutics, and I think we need to stay positive about the impact we can have and maintain that momentum of optimism and enthusiasm for innovation.
Oh, for this group, that's the easy part. Right, well, are there any last minute questions for the panelists? Yes, we have one in the back, please.
So with the highly variable input material, how are some of the challenges in the manufacturing process for CAR-T that didn't exist when you control your input material better?
What's the question exactly?
The variability of the apheresis products as they come in, as opposed to when you can control your starting input.
I think that's an important aspect there that we need to address, because in clinical trials, you have a certain degree of variability, especially when you do clinical trial on 100 patients in particular indication. So you have a certain variability. When you go to the commercial stage, where you're addressing hundreds of thousands of patients, by definition, the variability will increase there. And that's where you need to have make permanent process improvement to be able to address that variability, but also to engage with the regulatory authorities in the sense that some specifications that are related to a clinical trial on 100 patients might not be really the one to have when you start to treat thousands of patients. So it's a mix of process improvement and engagement with regulatory authorities to make sure that the specifications that are being set up, either for the apheresis material or for the end product, are really in line with that variability, but having in mind that we believe that we can prove every time that we have a safe and effective product there.
Thank you. So thank you for attending this morning, and thank you to the speakers. Before we close the session, I have a public service announcement. This is not fake news, but at 11:30 today, you will all receive on your cell phones a presidential alert. At least those of you who have US cell phones will receive some sort of presidential alert system test. It's some act that's been passed, and just don't be alarmed, but at one point these audiences will light up. There's nothing going on, I think, I hope. But that would be a good time to have something go on, wouldn't it, as I think about it. So please thank the speakers. Thank you. Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you.